Chapter 7. The fire was immense. Like a monster, it consumed both the docks and the town square, shooting sparks and embers high into the night sky. Despite standing only a few paces away, though, Elsa couldn't hear its roar or feel its heat. It was a silent beast devouring its prey. She knew she should run, escape to the castle and warn the others, but she couldn't move. She couldn't even look away. As she peered into the flames, she saw the silhouettes of men wandering to and fro as if unaware they'd been swallowed by fire. One of the figures separated itself from the others and approached, and though she couldn't see his face, she recognized he wore the garb of a dignitary, a white jacket with tasseled shoulders and black knee-high boots. He stopped, as if unable to pass beyond the wall of fire which separated them, and raised a hand, beckoning her forward. She was compelled to respond. By some inexplicable force of will, she wanted to go to him, and she took a step forward, then another. She paused at the fire's edge, touching it, but felt nothing. Another step carried her beyond the fiery barrier, but as she passed through the wall of flame, everything changed. The man disappeared, and she heard screams from the town square, saw her people running and flailing, their bodies engulfed in flames. It was no longer just the square which burned. All of Arendelle was on fire, the roof of every house spouting yellow flames. Another scream came from behind her, and she whirled to see a figure fleeing the castle, running toward her and crying out her name. It was Anna. Elsa awoke with a start, her bedsheets soaked with sweat. She lay still for a long while, the bitter taste of fear lingering in the back of her throat as she tried to sort reality from dream world. The fire last night had been a terrible one, that was for certain, but all of Arendelle hadn't burned. The docks sustained some damage, she recalled that, but she'd created an ice wall to prevent the flames from spreading, so the town square was untouched and the fire had certainly not reached any of the houses. Still, it took her a moment to cast off the fading remnants of the dream and calm her beating heart. She pushed back the blankets and sat up, scrubbing her hands across her face, and became aware of a throbbing in her temples. She'd gone to bed with a headache and awoke with it still there, giving her the sense she'd benefited little from the night's rest. That didn't bode well for the day which lay before her, she thought. She sat on the edge of the bed with her head in her hands, rubbing her temples, then she pushed herself to her feet, fighting a bout of nausea. When it passed, she went to the window and drew back the curtains, flinching at the sunlight. She squinted and blinked as she tried to judge the position of the sun, deciding it must be mid-morning, perhaps 9 o'clock or half past. Her staff had been merciful enough not to wake her, but it was about an hour before dawn when she'd retired for the night and she was still suffering the effects of a half a night's sleep. She thought about what happened as she went to a water basin, bathing herself with a damp cloth before dressing for the day. She couldn't help but wonder if there was something more she could have done. She was sure everyone expected her to stop the fire with her magic, but she didn't know how. There was still so much she didn't understand about her powers, so much she didn't know. She once froze the entire fjord, from bank to bank, trapping a dozen boats within its ice, and to this day she didn't know how she did it. So, when confronted with the inferno in the harbor, she hadn't known what to do, other than wait for the flames to die down and use seawater to put it out. By the time the moon had dipped behind the mountains, leaving it pitch dark on the docks, it was deemed too dangerous to mount a salvage operation. They decided to wait for morning to continue, and she retired to her room more exhausted than she'd ever been in her life. And as she stood before the mirror, adjusting her bun and slipping on her shoes, she wasn't feeling much better. She went to the door and pulled it open, surprised to find a guard standing outside. "Oh," she said, looking to see if there was anyone else out there. There wasn't. "Hello. Have you been out here all morning?" "Yes, Your Majesty. We have orders that you're to be kept under guard at all times." She recalled Alex saying something to that effect just before she left for her room, but she'd been so tired it hadn't registered. "Very well," she said, closing the door behind her. "I'm headed to the throne room." As she followed the guard down the hall, she thought about Alec's order of protection. Guards were a common sight throughout the castle, even with their numbers more than halved because of the drought. They were often seen surveying the grounds, patrolling the hallways, and monitoring the throne room. But up until last night, she'd never had one posted outside her door while she slept. The burning ships had rattled them, and they were on high alert. But was the fire truly an act of arson? John was convinced the fire was set intentionally. She recalled his ashen face as he declared there was a traitor in their midst, but she hadn't a moment to consider the implications of that. At the time, her only concern was stopping the fire and preventing its spread, and even after they succeeded in putting it out, she'd been too exhausted to consider what caused it. Even Alec's final words hadn't registered. He'd said, "We need to find out who did this," and she'd nodded but was too fatigued to discuss the significance of what he was suggesting. She'd returned to the castle and collapsed into bed and hadn't considered the possibility she was in danger. But now she wondered if there was an enemy hiding somewhere, lurking within the shadows of her kingdom and waiting for the opportunity to strike again. She glanced over her shoulder, struck by the feeling someone could be watching her, hiding in a corner or peeking through the crack of a door. She shivered and crossed her arms, stepping a little closer to the guard. It was an unpleasant thought, one that reminded her of a story her father once read her as a child. In it, a king had a portrait of himself hung in his bedroom across from his bed. Sometimes he'd awake at night and notice how the eyes of that picture would glisten in the moonlight. He gave credit to the remarkable artist who was able to achieve such realism, but by the end of the story you discover there was an escaped prisoner living in the walls of the castle. He'd removed the bricks from behind the painting, cut holes where its eyes were, and spied on the king while he slept. The story had creeped Elsa out, and now she felt that same feeling again, like insects were crawling down her neck and prickling across her skin. The only difference was, this time it wasn't some imaginary king who was being watched, it was her. But was someone really watching her? Was there an enemy hiding amongst them? If there was, she had no idea who it could be. After all, there weren't many people left in Arendelle, just a handful of servants and guards and a spattering of residents scattered throughout the city. Of these, who was worthy of mistrust? Certainly not any member of her staff. She knew each of her servants personally, and none of them would be capable of such an atrocious act. So what about the guards, then? She wasn't as familiar with them, but they had Alec's trust, and each one chose to stay and protect her when everyone else had fled for their lives. Therefore, she held them in the highest regard. So that left only her people. They were all poor farmers and carpenters and stoneworkers. What reason would they have to engage in such a deplorable act? It didn't make any sense. What motive would anyone in Arendelle have for setting the ships on fire? Despite John and Alec's insistence to the contrary, she wondered if it could have been an accident. She once heard of a kingdom who lost their entire harbor and every ship in it to fire. Someone was careless enough to leave a lantern unattended, and it slid off the table during a storm, setting the whole boat alight. The flames leapt from boat to boat and spread into part of the city before it was extinguished. Wasn't it possible something similar happened here? She supposed it was, but it didn't change much either way. Whether it was an accident or an intentional act of sabotage, the effects were just as devastating. Her stomach twisted with worry when they arrived at the throne room, and she hurried through the archway, leaving the guard outside. Marshmallow stirred as she entered, but she paid him little heed, going instead to the window overlooking the docks. The night had been a dark one, and when the fires were extinguished, it was difficult to determine the full level of destruction. The damage was extensive, to be sure, but a part of her hoped there might be a way to salvage one of the ships and make it seaworthy again. She kept thinking maybe it wouldn't be as bad as she remembered, that her imagination might be exaggerating her memory. However, from her perch on the second floor of the castle, she saw it was even worse than she expected. There was a collection of people at the edge of the square overlooking the harbor, leaning on the ropes and pointing at the ships, at least what remained of them. One of the ships had sunk to the bottom of the harbor and only its mast could be seen, rising from the waters like a slender grave marker, burnt sails hanging in blackened strips. The other two were little more than charred remains, smoldering husks floating ghost-like upon the water. Men crawled over the wreckage, probably John's men surveying the damage, but the hopelessness of the situation was clear. Every ship was a complete loss. There would be no salvaging any of them. She went to the throne and sat down, burying her face in her hands. She couldn't believe this had happened. John had only come to help, to offer his assistance to a dying land. But now he'd lost everything, not to mention he was stranded with no way home. How could such an act of generosity be repaid with such evil? Because Arendelle is cursed. She flinched at the thought. There was a time when a thought like that would have been discarded as fiction, a ridiculous stretch of the undisciplined imagination, but she didn't feel that way now. It seemed too strong a possibility to dismiss, considering the evidence. The drought was unnatural, that was for certain. Nothing like it had ever been seen, and every other kingdom around them prospered. So maybe Arendelle was cursed after all. Maybe she was naive to think they'd ever find water. Maybe nothing could prevent the kingdom from dying and taking with it any who were too poor to escape, too foolish to leave, or had the misfortune of trying to help. Maybe the Duke had been right all along. Elsa, you have cursed this land. She sat with her head in her hands, wondering, and not for the first time, if it could be true. I'm sorry, Your Highness, came the guard's voice from outside the throne room, but I cannot allow him through. Anton? Came Anna's sharp reply. Get out of my way! Elsa raised her eyes, her attention drawn by the voices, and she was shocked to see long spikes of ice protruding from the walls around her, pushing inward as they grew and extended. She looked behind her and found the entire room lined with them. Marshmallow had stepped away from the wall to avoid being impaled. I'm sorry, Your Highness, but only members of the royal family are allowed to see the Queen today. Captain's orders. Any other time, Elsa might have gone to see what was going on in the hallway, but she was transfixed by the deadly ice clinging to the walls around her. She couldn't believe it was there, hadn't even felt the magic go out of her. However, it wasn't a total surprise. She'd seen it once before. After her coronation, when she fled to the North Mountain, Anna had followed to tell her the kingdom was buried under the snow of an unnatural winter. Only then did she realize how dangerous she truly was, and she'd chased Anna and Kristoff off the mountain to protect them. She tried to rein in her emotions then, tried to control the fear which threatened to overtake her, but she'd failed. That was the first time she'd seen the spikes, sprouting from every wall and column in her ice palace, and she was horrified to see them again. I don't care what your orders are, Anna said. Get out of my way! There was a ruckus, then Anna said, No, stay out here, before she appeared through the archway with John. She strode into the room in a huff, dragging John by the arm, but her anger melted when she saw the walls. Elsa, it's freezing in here! Elsa hadn't noticed, but the temperature had plunged. Anna crossed her arms and rubbed at her shoulders, shivering as her breath came out in puffs of white steam. John cupped his hands over his mouth and blew, rubbing them together in an attempt to keep warm. Elsa waved a hand at the ice, like a cave explorer brushing away cobwebs, then rubbed her eyes trying to massage the pain which throbbed in her head. When she looked up again, she gasped. The ice was still there. She waved her hand again, but nothing happened. It was like something inside her was blocking the flow of magic. She focused, concentrated, tried to will it away. Nothing. She didn't understand. Why wasn't her magic responding? During the Great Thaw, she'd ended the eternal winter by ridding the land of all unwanted snow, right down to the smallest snowflake. So why couldn't she remove the ice? Her magic always obeyed. No, not always. Then panic set in. It was a feeling of hopelessness, something she hadn't experienced for a long time but was all too familiar. It was like she was a child again, cowering in the corner of her room as ice crawled across the floor and up the walls, hoping and praying no one came to visit while her magic betrayed her. As long as it acted of its own accord, then no one was safe. She had to get it under control. Conceal, don't feel. It had been a long time since she'd invoked the mantra which was once part of her daily life, and it brought no comfort to fall back on the staple of her isolation now, but it made no difference. The ice remained. Anna started toward her, and John followed. Elsa leapt up. "No! Stay away!" John stopped, but Anna kept going, quickening her pace as she approached. Elsa hurried around the throne, placing it between them like a barrier. "Anna, please, I don't want to hurt you." "Elsa," Anna said, "are you okay? I can't make it stop. Please, you need to leave." "I'm not going anywhere." She moved toward Elsa, but Elsa circled away, keeping the throne between them. "There's nothing you could have done about the fire, I mean. You know that, don't you?" "Yes, I know, but you need to leave before you get hurt." "Elsa," John said, his voice low and calm and filled with concern. She turned to face him, and he started toward her, holding his hands out, palms up. "What has got you so upset?" At first the question perturbed her. How could he even ask such a thing? She had a million reasons to be upset, the least of which not being the fiery destruction and total loss of every ship in her harbor. Then she reminded herself those were his ships. If anyone had reason to be upset, it was him. "John, I'm so sorry." "For what?" "You lost everything last night. I'm so sorry." "Is that what you're upset about?" He waved his hand as if it were a trivial concern. "It's really not that bad when you think about it. I have my health and my friends, and what more does a man really need?" He gave her a smile and appeared genuinely unruffled. Elsa couldn't understand how he could have already made peace with a tragedy whose repercussions weren't yet fully known. How could he be so calm in the face of adversity? Did he understand the gravity of the situation? "But you're stuck here now. You're stranded in Arendelle. You can't leave." He stopped before her, barely more than an arm's length away. His gaze was intense, his blue eyes flashing in the light of the window. "What makes you think I want to leave?" She wondered if he truly meant what he was saying. She couldn't imagine being stuck in another kingdom with no way to get home to her family or her people, especially if that kingdom was as inhospitable and unforgiving as Arendelle was now. How could he possibly not want to leave? "You don't mean that." "Elsa, I have never spoken more truly in my life. Since my arrival, I've been absolutely captivated by your kingdom and its people, and quite frankly by you. If there was ever anywhere I could hope to be stranded, it would be right here with you, standing by your side while you fight to save Arendelle from this drought." He seemed so earnest, so honest, and she had to believe what he was saying was true. Anna came over and grabbed her hand and gave it a squeeze, and that's when Elsa noticed the ice had disappeared. "It's gone," she said with surprise. She hadn't sensed any change in her magic, but the ice had vanished without a trace. Anna gave her a smile. "Of course it is." "But," Elsa said, looking at Marshmallow, who was once again standing against the wall. She looked at the walls, then back at Anna. "I couldn't do it before." "You did it now," John said, "and that's all that matters." Elsa sank back into her throne. She was glad the ice was gone, but she couldn't believe she'd lost control again. This was the third time in as many days, and each episode seemed to be getting worse. If she couldn't get it under control, she was afraid of what might happen, how far things might go. Why couldn't she control it? What was she missing? Love. Love is the key. Yes, she knew that, but that wasn't helping at the moment. Nothing seemed to be helping. She had to get her emotions in check, had to rein in her anxiety, because if she didn't... "Are you all right?" Anna said. Elsa tried to reassure her with a smile, but it felt unconvincing. "Yes, I'm all right." "And I'm a purple grasshopper," John said. "No, really, I'm okay. Don't worry about me. With all due respect, Your Majesty, I'll worry about whatever I want, and right now I'm worried about you." "What about your ships?" "My ships? You think I'm worried about my ships? Ships can be replaced. They are just things. And what about your men? My men are thankful they were safe in their beds when the ships went down. Many a sailor has not been so lucky. Yes, but nothing. You need to stop worrying about the things you can't control and focus on the things you can. Your stress levels are far too high, Elsa. When was the last time you had a respite from all your troubles? A what? A respite, a holiday. You're in desperate need of a distraction. Something to take your mind off your problems. A distraction? Yes, precisely. To be honest, I think we could all benefit from a little diversion. He rubbed his chin and thought for a moment. Then he snapped his fingers. I've got it. What about the party? Party? Anna said. What party? John's words caught Elsa off guard. She'd forgotten about the party. In fact, it was the furthest thing from her mind, and it took a moment to catch up to the sudden change of subject. John seemed to detect her confusion. I'm sorry. Have I misspoken? If the party was supposed to be a surprise, I truly apologize. Elsa, what is he talking about? The way Anna looked at her, Elsa knew she was searching for an explanation, but the answer escaped her. She'd been so preoccupied with birth announcements, undiscovered relatives, and massive infernos that she hadn't even given the party due consideration. I hardly think this is the time to be planning parties. I couldn't disagree more, John said. I think a party is exactly what this kingdom needs right now. While there's a traitor running around burning down ships? I don't think so. Traitor? Anna said. John doesn't think the fire was an accident. I may have spoken too soon, John said, holding up his hands. I was under a lot of stress last night, and I may have jumped to a few conclusions. So you think the fire was an accident? Elsa said. Maybe. Maybe? Yes, maybe. Look, Elsa, your kingdom is sinking into the mire of despair. You know this, and I know this. I saw it on your face when I arrived. I see it in your servants' eyes, and I hear it in the people's voices. Everyone has lost hope. Now you can sulk in the throne room and wait in fear for the next bad thing to happen, or you can grab this kingdom by the collar and drag it out of the God-forsaken mud that's swallowing it. Let your guards do their job. If there's a traitor, they'll find him, and if there's not, you're spending a whole lot of time worrying about nothing. I urge you, your majesty, show this kingdom what it means to have hope. Show them you haven't lost hope. A celebration is exactly what everyone needs. What is he talking about? Anna said. John's blunt evaluation didn't upset Elsa, and she had to admit he made a good point. She supposed they had little to lose by holding a celebration. She figured it would be either a moment of hope to lead them out of this disaster, or it would be a last hurrah to bid farewell to the kingdom. She truly hoped it wouldn't be the latter. He's talking about your engagement party, of course. Engagement party? Are you serious? She clasped her hands before her, which made Elsa smile. Her sister always did that when she was trying to remain calm in the face of excitement. You better not be joking. If you're teasing me, I'm not teasing you, Elsa said, standing up to take her hands. John is right. We can't stop living our lives just because everything's not going according to plan. I don't intend on letting the most important event of your life go uncelebrated. Not when I have the means to do so. It doesn't have to be big, but it will be memorable. Anna tried to stifle an outburst and produced a muffled squeal of delight. Then she threw her arms around her sister and squeezed. Thank you! You have no idea how much this means to me. I think I do, but it wouldn't have been possible without... She was going to say John, but Anna had already turned and flung her arms around his neck. John's eyes flew open in surprise, his hands thrust out before him as if he didn't know what to do. Then Anna stepped away, wearing a sheepish grin. Sorry, she said, then turned back to Elsa, her hands covering her mouth as she gasped. What am I going to wear? What's Kristoff going to wear? She grabbed Elsa's arm. When is it? Who's going to be there? When are we sending invitations? Not to worry. I'll take care of all of that. The truth was, she didn't know the answer to any of those questions. She supposed they should have the party sooner rather than later, though. As awful as it was to consider, Arundel was wasting away, and she had no idea when things would start getting better. If they ever got better. No, she refused to think that way. Things were going to get better. They had to. And if they didn't? She knew what she'd have to do if they didn't get better. She'd known from the moment she drove the Duke away in a flurry of uncontrolled magic. She knew, but she didn't want to think about it, not now. That time hadn't yet arrived, and she hoped it never did. "Elsa," Anna said, putting a hand on her arm. "Are you all right?" Elsa nodded, but her thoughts had turned to the Duke who she so scornfully rejected. He was probably setting sail right now, racing to claim the land she'd promised, and she didn't look forward to the confrontation which would ensue. She had no idea what would happen when he arrived, but she knew one thing. No one would feel much like celebrating after he showed up. "How about we have it the day after tomorrow?" "The day after tomorrow? Are you serious?" "Absolutely." "But that barely gives us any time to plan." "It's plenty of time. That gives us 2 whole days. We'll prepare the invitations and send them out tonight. The servants can start decorating and preparing the food, and I think we'll even be able to scrounge up a band. It'll be perfect." "Okay," Anna said, her excitement tempered by doubt. "Who will we invite?" "All of Arundel, of course." "All of Arundel? Will everyone fit in the ballroom?" Elsa considered this and realized she may have spoken too soon. It was true, there weren't many people left in Arundel, but if they all came, as Elsa knew they would, the ballroom would be filled to maximum capacity. It might be standing room only, and that wouldn't do at all. How would they dance? There was no way she was going to throw a party for Anna without dancing. "Why not have it in the courtyard?" John said. "The courtyard?" Elsa said. It was an unconventional suggestion. All royal affairs took place in the ballroom. It was a beautiful place designed for just that purpose, but the courtyard was little more than an open space with drab walls and a stone floor. It hardly seemed like the ideal location. "Well, sure," John said. "It's probably big enough to hold everyone, and it's not like you have to worry about the rain, right?" He gave a playful shrug. Elsa didn't find the rain comment humorous, but he did have a point. Perhaps it wasn't the perfect location under normal circumstances, but these were far from normal circumstances. "What do you think?" Elsa asked Anna. Anna shrugged. "Sure." "Very well, it's settled. We'll have it in the courtyard, and everyone will be invited." Anna's excitement returned as she bounced on her toes. "Oh, Elsa, it's going to be wonderful! I've got to tell Kristoff. We have to start decorating." "Hold on just a minute. I have something else to discuss with you." "You do?" She knew Anna was excited to begin preparations, but she had a matter that she couldn't trust to just anyone. Anna could attend to it while the rest of the castle readied for the celebration. "John, thank you for your counsel. I appreciate it." "Of course," he said with a bow. "I need to talk to my sister. Alone. Would you mind excusing us?" "Not at all. I'll be on the docks if you need me. My men have already begun dismantling what remains of the ships. They should be gone before your celebration. Once again, I'm sorry for your loss. And once again, don't let a minor setback distract you from more important things. It's not every day your sister gets engaged, after all." He gave her a wink, then left. Anna waited until his footsteps faded down the hall, then said, "So, what did you want to talk to me about?" Elsa gathered her dress and sat down, but she wasn't sure where to start. She thought about her evening in the archives and how she stumbled across the name of a relative she'd never heard of. It occurred to her Anna might already know about the aunt, and she might be the only one her father kept the secret from. She had no reason to believe this, but still, it bothered her. Secrets in general bothered her. They either meant someone wasn't trusted or something dangerous needed to be hidden, and either way she didn't like it. "Did you know we had an aunt?" Elsa said at last. "An aunt? What do you mean?" She was relieved to see Anna's confusion. "It would seem father had a twin." "A twin? What are you talking about?" "I was in the archives last night, looking for John's birth announcement." "So that's where you went." "Yes, and while I was there I found father's birth record." only it had another name on it, a Princess Inger. Have you heard of her before?" "No, never." "Nor have I, and that's why it's so strange." Anna shrugged. "Maybe she died as a baby." "Yes, that's exactly what I thought, but I found her death record too. It says she was lost at sea at the age of 19. "Really?" Elsa nodded. "That doesn't make sense," Anna said. "Why wouldn't Father tell us about her?" "I don't know, but I think it's worth investigating, don't you?" "Yes, of course." "Then I'd like you to go to the archives. You'll find the key in my room. See what you can find out about this Princess Inger. I don't like secrets in my castle. I want to know why Father kept her hidden from us." "Okay. If you need any help, just ask Tobias. I'm sure he'll—" Elsa stopped short, her attention drawn to the archway as someone entered the throne room. It was Alec, followed by 2 of his guards. He looked terrible, Elsa thought. His eyes were red and ringed with dark circles, and he had charcoal smudges all over his face, hands, and uniform. The guards with him were equally disheveled, looking like they'd rolled through the ashes of a fireplace. When Alec looked at Anna, Elsa detected something in his expression. Disapproval or disappointment, she wasn't sure. "I apologize for the intrusion, Your Majesty, but I understand John was here." Elsa didn't like his tone. It sounded like a scolding, as if John's visit were some sort of crime or a violation of protocol. "Yes, he was." She wanted to ask him why he was questioning her choice of company, but she decided on a more diplomatic approach. "Is there a problem with that?" "My men have orders to keep everyone out of the throne room until we can sort this mess out." It seemed like an extreme measure, banning everyone from the throne room, and she didn't like Alec making such wide-sweeping decisions without her. Then she recalled Anna's confrontation with the guard when her and John first arrived. "Did you know about this?" she asked Anna. "Well," Anna said, grimacing. "Not really. Kind of. Yes." Elsa raised an eyebrow. "John was so worried about you. He wanted to come see you, but they were practically holding him prisoner at the docks. I had to sneak him out of there." The thought of John being made to feel like a prisoner after all he'd been through invoked Elsa's ire. "I gave no such order," she said to Alec. "No, Your Majesty. You were sleeping. Keeping John and his men contained was my decision, and Princess Anna, who was supposed to be in the castle under guard herself, ditched her protection in order to undermine my authority. She showed a willful disregard for everyone's safety, and what's more, that's enough, Alec." Elsa's emotions were beginning to boil, but she wasn't sure what upset her more, his treatment of John or his accusation against Anna. "Your Majesty, you don't seem to understand the seriousness of the situation." "I think I do." "Then why would you allow the princess to endanger—" "I will not have Anna's motives called into question, nor will I allow John and his men to be treated like criminals." It was a harsh rebuttal, but Alec didn't back down. His expression hardened as he took a step forward, jabbing a finger at the window. "Your Majesty, those ships didn't burn themselves down." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that until we find out who was responsible for setting fire to the ships, you allow me to do what needs to be done to protect you." "You think John did that?" "It's a possibility we need to consider." "And what proof do you have?" "I said it's a possibility." "Isn't it also possible those fires weren't set by John?" She waited for his response, but it didn't come. He tried to hide his anger behind his silence, but she could see it in the way he set his jaw and the way he hunched his shoulders. She was angry too, angry that John would be treated like an enemy of her kingdom. "Is it possible that the fire was just an accident?" "I find that unlikely." "Well, I find it unlikely that he'd sail 3 ships full of supplies all the way to Arendelle just to burn them to the ground. You will not come in here making accusations without a shred of evidence to back it up. Until we have reason to believe otherwise, Prince John and his men will not be treated as enemies. Do you understand?" Alec just stared at her with cold, hard eyes. His stubbornness to accept any possibility which opposed his own outlandish assumptions infuriated her. "Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Majesty." Elsa tried to settle her nerves. She'd never argued with Alec before, not like this, and she didn't like it. Why was he so intent on pinning such a despicable act on John? What reason did he have to mistrust him? There was no reason, other than his relation to Hans, and it wasn't fair to judge a man by his family. She knew it was Alec's job to protect her, but she wouldn't allow him to alienate those who'd risked their lives to help Arendelle, not without any evidence to support his accusations. "Will there be anything else, Your Majesty?" "No," she said, her heart still racing from their confrontation. "That will be all." Alec left, leaving the guards behind to keep watch over the archway. There was a silence for a time, and then Anna asked, "What's gotten into him?" "I don't know," Elsa said while massaging her temples. Her headache had returned, and it throbbed with each beat of her elevated pulse. She groaned and rubbed at her eyes, the accumulated exhaustion of the last 6 months seeming to descend on her all at once. She wondered if her father ever had to deal with such overwhelming problems. He'd always been busy, meeting with dignitaries, hosting heads of state, and advancing kingdom interests, but he never seemed overwhelmed by the issues confronting him. She detected a sadness in him at times, that was true. Whenever he came to read to her, or discuss her magic, or put her to bed for the night, he'd give her a smile, and sometimes she saw sadness hiding behind that smile. But he never seemed overwhelmed. How had he managed to cope with the burden of the crown? Of course, he'd never had to deal with anything as complex or destructive as this drought. Perhaps no ruler in the history of Arendelle ever had. "Kristoff!" Elsa looked up to see Anna running toward Kristoff. She met him at the entrance to embrace him, and as he hugged her, Elsa saw in his eyes he hadn't got much sleep either. It would seem they were all suffering from sleep deprivation. Massive nocturnal fires had a way of doing that, she supposed. "Guess what?" Anna said, her excitement showing again. "We're going to have an engagement party." "A what?" Kristoff said, holding her at arm's length as if to inspect her. "What kind of engagement party?" "The kind where people dance and have a good time, silly." Kristoff pushed her aside. His hair was ruffled and he had a black smudge mark on his chin, which Anna wiped at with a spit-moistened thumb. He brushed her hand away. "Is that true?" he asked Elsa. There was a hint of disapproval in the question, and Elsa didn't like it, as if he thought she were guilty of some negligence or carelessness for throwing them a party. "Yes, we're going to use some of the supplies John delivered to celebrate your engagement. Nothing extravagant, not like what you deserve, but a celebration of this sort could do wonders to lift everyone's spirit." Kristoff frowned. "Do you think that's the wisest use of Arendelle's resources?" It seemed like everyone had been doubting her ability to care for her people lately, and she was growing wary of it. "That's not for you to decide." I know, he said, raising his hands. "But if we don't find water, we're going to need every one of those provisions to last as long as possible, especially with the additional mouths to feed." "You don't think I know that?" Her anger barely had a chance to settle, and now it was rising again. "A couple days' worth of provisions isn't going to save Arendelle if this drought continues. Besides, what good will it be if we survive the drought with a broken spirit?" Kristoff didn't appear moved by her words. He stood silent, as if he were waiting for a further explanation, then shook his head. "I don't understand. This doesn't sound like you at all. It's just not practical, Elsa. Have you thought this through?" "Of course I have." "Kristoff," Anna said, grabbing his arm, but he ignored her. "Wait a minute," he said, as if realizing something. "Was this John's idea?" "Why would that matter?" "Are you kidding me? Are you telling me you still trust him after what happened last night?" Elsa rolled her eyes. "Don't tell me you think he set his ships on fire too." "Well, isn't it obvious?" "No, it isn't. Why would he do that?" Kristoff put his hands on his head and turned away, exasperated. Then he spun back around, his voice teetering on the edge of a shout. "Because now he's stuck here and can take his time to execute whatever evil plot he has in mind for Arendelle." She'd had her limit of people accusing John of being a treacherous killer scheming to overthrow her kingdom. She didn't know why it made her so angry, but it did, and she glared at Kristoff through the tops of her eyes. "Elsa, don't be a fool. Don't let John finish what Hans started." "John is not Hans," she yelled, shooting out of her seat. "And I will not have my decisions questioned by an ice deliverer." Anna gasped and Kristoff straightened, his back stiffening. Although he tried to hide it, Elsa knew her words had stung him. I'm sorry, Kristoff, she said, putting a hand over her mouth as she fell back into the throne, every reason for her anger evaporating in an instant. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it. Kristoff hardened his expression, removing any trace of hurt from his eyes. He sniffed and wiped at his nose with the back of his arm. Anna tried to take his hand, but he shook her off. I'd like permission to take a delivery of water to my family. His voice was cold, emotionless. Tears burned in her eyes. She'd hurt the one man who'd given more than anyone else, who'd sacrificed everything he had for Arendelle. And all that remained, all that he held so dear, had been destroyed by the drought. It had taken his business, his livelihood, his identity, and his self-respect. It had taken any chance he might have had for a normal courtship with Anna, and it had robbed him of nearly all hope for a happy future. And if all that wasn't enough, now she'd taken his dignity with her cruel words. He was waiting for her response, and she knew he wanted to leave. Caring for the rock trolls who'd raised him was one of the few things that gave him a sense of purpose, but she was afraid if he left he might miss his own party. Of course you can. Just please wait until after your party. Kristoff turned to go. Anna put a hand on his shoulder. No, Anna, he said, brushing her hand away. I need to be alone. He hurried out the archway. Anna's eyes filled with tears as she glared at Elsa. Elsa wanted to say something, to find an explanation for her actions, but she was unable to offer anything in her defense. How could you? Anna said, then she left too, and Elsa sat alone, listening to the soft click of her sister's shoes as they faded into the distance.